The truth is that you don't want to play Ace Combat just to soar through the beautiful blue skies or to look at the amazing scenery from high altitude. Yay! I can fly through the clouds! Let's be real, you want to play Ace Combat so you can take your awesome fighter jet and kill enemies with air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground missiles, unguided bombs, laser-guided bombs, cluster bombs, rockets, anti-ship missiles, cannon fire, electromagnetic railguns, and let's not forget one of my favorites, napalm bombs. Because who doesn't like the smell of napalm in the morning? Well, probably the people in Vietnam. Welcome to Ace Combat 101, a project created to introduce new players to Bandai Namco's flight shooter series. Whether you have never played a flight shooter game or it has been a while since you last played one, this miniseries will cover how to maneuver your aircraft efficiently, how to use your weapons properly, and also give you some pro tips on air-to-air, air-to-ground, and air-to-sea engagements. My name is Ace Combat Fan, and I'm glad you're here for the second episode of this video and article collaborative series between myself, Tomcat171, and the team of Project Lighthouse. In case you've missed, Tomcat171 has already covered in the first video tutorial of this series the basic aircraft controls, including 3-dimensional navigation, the different types of control schemes, basic maneuvers including low-level fight, because we all know you want to do those low flybys, and also a basic overview of the heads-up display and how you can use its instrumentation. I highly recommend you to watch that video first, because before unleashing your lethal ordnance against your enemies, you will need to know how to maneuver your aircraft first. Otherwise, it would be like shooting your weapons on Call of Duty without moving your characters, and only campers do that. In this series of videos, both me and Tomcat171 will be using gameplay footage from Ace Combat 6 for demonstration purposes, but the same concepts apply to pretty much any Ace Combat games, including the older titles and the newest installment of the series, Ace Combat 7. With that said, this second episode will cover how to identify, select, and use your weaponry on enemy targets so you can spread democracy and freedom to all those who you disagree with. If you are already familiar with some of the concepts in this list, you may jump to the topic you want to learn more about by using the corresponding timestamp. Now, before we get started with the napalm delivery service to your enemies, just one quick disclaimer. Ace Combat is not a simulator, it's an arcade flight shooter. This means you can just pick up the controller and play the game without reading an 800-page manual for each playable aircraft. If you really want to play a game where you can switch the fuel from both tanks to the left fuel tank only, then that's not a game. That's a simulator to the likes of DCS. Now let's begin by talking about the HUD, your heads-up display, and how it relates to the use of weaponry. The HUD may look intimidating to new players at first, so let's break this down into smaller pieces like Yugoslavia. I'm going to block the areas that have been covered by Tomcat171 in episode 1 together with the elements that aren't really important for this tutorial. Looks much more simple now, doesn't it? Now let's divide the screen into three main sections. The first section is the radar map. It can be found on the bottom left of your screen. The radar map is very helpful in locating enemies, showing where your aircraft is headed and where your allies are located. The second section is your aircraft information overlay. It includes your available weapons, how much ammunition you have, and a damage indicator. I will talk more about these two sections further along the video. The third and last section is pretty much the rest of the screen. This is your hunting field where you'll be able to find enemy targets, which are represented by either green squares or green hexagons. Squares are meant to display airborne targets such as bombers, fighters, or helicopters. On the other hand, hexagons represent ground targets such as tanks, trucks, and surface-to-air missile launchers, also known as SAMs. Mind you, naval targets like destroyers and aircraft carriers are also represented by hexagons. Your aircraft will automatically select an enemy target if the target enters your aircraft's detection range. You can identify which target was selected visually. It is always the one blinking. But what do you do if you want to change the target? To change the target, you simply press triangle or Y on your controller and you'll be assigned another target. One tool to help you out in this process is the next text. Whenever you see next displayed on your HUD, That means that particular target will be your next selected target if you press the change target button. If your new target is not the one you want, just keep pressing the button until you have selected the desired target. Pro tip: quickly changing targets is a fast and effective way of identifying and assessing the enemy forces from long range. This will give you more time to plan for your attack and prioritize high value targets such as enemy aircraft carriers. Once you have your target selected, you will get two very important pieces of information displayed on the side of the target. First, you will get the distance between you and the enemy target, which is very important when it comes to using weapons because each weapon has its own effective range. Another way of measuring distance is using the bar on the right side of the HUD close to your altimeter. This bar features a little arrow indicating the enemy target. The further away this arrow is from the bottom, the further away you are from the target. Once your arrow is below this mark, you will be able to lock your guided weapons onto the target. But again, this scale is only available on the HUD or cockpit views. The second piece of information is the type of enemy target. For aircraft, you'll be able to read the specific model of the enemy, such as an F-14 or a Sukhoi 33. For ground targets, you get a generic description such as tank, SAM, or destroyer. This is crucial information pertaining to the tactics you should employ. For instance, you can fly very slow close to an enemy truck because a truck won't harm you. However, if you fly low and slow close to a SAM launcher, you're gonna have a bad time. Once you have selected the enemy you want to destroy, locking onto it is the easiest thing to do. Simply get in range and look at the magic happening in front of your eyes. Your target will automatically change from green to red and you will hear a distinctive noise which is music to the ears of any Ace Combat fan. This sound means your guided weapons are locked on and you can fire away by pressing the circle or B button on your controller. I will discuss the different types of weapons further along the video, but here's a pro tip. You can hold the circle or B button to activate the missile camera so you can see all the explosive action closely. At least that's how Michael Bay would play this game. There are still some details to be mentioned regarding the target display on your HUD. The first one is the TGT marking located to the left of the target icon and written in red. The TGT marking indicates that the target must be destroyed for you to clear the mission as they are related to the main mission objective. For instance, since this gameplay is from a bomber intercept mission, only enemy bombers are marked as TGTs. But the reality is that any enemy can become a TGT. It all depends on the mission objective. Sometimes you will also see enemy aircraft identified by a certain name, like this F-16 named Edinorog. This is one example of an enemy ace. Enemy aces can be found throughout the Ace Combat games and they are quite special. They have a more advanced AI than regular enemy targets, and when you shoot down one of them, you will not only get extra points added to your score, you usually get a unique paint scheme for the aircraft that they were flying. So always keep your eyes open for named enemy targets and shoot them down whenever possible. Another important detail to mention is when you get a dashed line around the targets instead of a solid line. Whenever a target is marked by a dashed line, that means that particular target is obstructed, usually by terrain. In this example, you can see that I have selected an enemy gunboat as my target, but the line around it is dashed. It would be useless for me to start firing at it because the edges of the canyon are blocking my path and any ammunition that I fire will end up hitting the canyon and not the target. In this case, the correct procedure would be to maneuver to a better position and get a clear line of sight to the target. Once the target outline becomes solid, you're good to go. Another indicator on your HUD includes this funny looking box. It only means that it requires your attention or is very important for your mission. In this context, the boxes indicate where you're supposed to go during your patrol mission, but sometimes this box can also be used for enemy targets. Like that one time when a terrorist truck dropped some fried chicken. While fried chicken is a fine idea, getting yourself fried is not. So I should also mention how the HUD helps keeping you safe by sending 2 alerts of danger. The first one is the caution warning. It appears right in the middle of the screen and indicates that at least one enemy has locked onto you. Whenever you get the caution warning, try to identify where the enemy is located relative to you and anticipate defensive measures. In all likelihood, you will only have a short amount of time between the caution warning and the missile alert warning. The missile alert is impossible to miss because your entire HUD will turn red, and whenever you see red, you know you're in trouble. However, here's a pro tip. As you gain experience with the game, you'll be able to better identify the sources of enemy missiles, where they are coming from and how to evade them. Eventually, you'll get to a point where evading an enemy missile will just take minor adjustments to your flight path, or you simply ignore the missile alerts. But on the meantime, while you're still learning, just weave through the missiles. Last but not least, I should also mention how allied units are displayed in the HUD. Yes, those useless people who do nothing better but to waste fuel are indicated by the color blue. And no, you can't target or destroy them, believe me, if that was possible I wouldn't have annoyed squadron members. Now, if you ever feel overwhelmed by enemy aircraft chasing you, one good course of action is to head over to your friendly units. This should make some enemies go chase them instead of you. After all, isn't that what friends are for? Now let's talk about the radar map, which you should pay attention to constantly during the gameplay so you can keep a high awareness of the battle situation and detect new enemies. In your radar, enemy aircraft will appear as arrows, and wherever the arrow is pointing to, that's the direction where the enemy is flying to. Meanwhile, enemy ground or naval units are represented by circles. You can easily identify TGC targets on your radar. Simply look for those with a ring around it. As for the colors of the enemy targets, this is somewhat inconsistent in the Ace Combat games. In Ace Combat 6, for example, TGTs are colored red, while regular enemy targets are colored green on your radar. In some other games, most of the enemy aircraft are colored white, and the color changes depending on how much damage has been inflicted to the enemy target. Undamaged enemies are white, damaged enemies are yellow, and heavily damaged enemies are red. You get the idea. As for friendly units, they are always blue, with the one exception of Ace Combat 5 where your wingmen are colored green. One big problem with the radar is that it only works in 2 dimensions. So let's say you have selected your target, which is always the blinking one. You'll only be able to see if the target is in front or behind you, and to see if it's to your left or to your right. However, you cannot tell by your radar if the target is at a higher or lower altitude. There are 2 methods for locating an enemy target if it is outside of your visual screen. The first method is to simply press and hold the change target button, triangle or Y. This will pan your camera around your plane to point directly into the enemy target. This will give you a more cinematic feel to your gameplay. However, one issue with this method is that you won't be able to see your flight path. Not the best idea if you are flying low level. The second method is to use the target indicator arrow that pops up on your screen. This 3-dimensional arrow will appear anytime the selected target is outside of your screen, and it will simply point towards it. Combine that with your radar and you have a pretty good idea on what your enemy's relative position to you. Now, there is one important type of target that I have to mention whenever we talk about radar: the stealthy boys like the F-22, the Nighthawk, or the Sukhoi 57, and so on. Whenever you encounter enemy stealth aircraft, your radar is able to detect them, but only in one very important condition. Your aircraft must be facing the enemy stealth planes. If they are to your side or behind you, they will remain undetected. One big issue with this is that enemy stealth aircraft can just sneak in from behind you undetected and attack you. Unless you have a very good awareness or keep looking behind you from time to time, you will only notice them thanks to the caution and missile alerts, and by that time, it may be too late already. All in all, the radar is a very important tool, but keeping a constant scan between your screen, your surroundings, and your radar is essential, especially during late game because that is when the stealthy boys show up, or rather, they don't show up. Lastly, your radar automatically adjusts its range depending on the distance between you and your enemies. If there are too many enemies nearby, it will reduce the range so you get more detail. If all enemies are relatively far away, it will increase the range. You can also turn your radar into a map by pressing the radar button. Now let's talk about your weapons information menu thing located on the right side. This list includes your weapons and their respective ammunition. You will always start with the gun on top, followed by your standard missiles, your special weapons, and your flares. Sometimes. I say sometimes because in some games like Ace Combat 6, your planes don't have flares, so of course it doesn't show up on the HUD. Other games like Assault Horizon or Ace Combat 7 will feature flares, and that's where you can see how many you have remaining. Lastly, you get a damage indicator. This indicator is displayed in percentage, so you never see 100% because that means you dead. Mind you, the damage you receive is dependent on both the level of difficulty and your aircraft defense stats. If you play on easy with your A-10, you can perhaps take 3 missiles and keep flying. Play it on Ace and pretty much any plane can be shot down by just one enemy missile. Enemy gunfire damage also depends on the difficulty and your aircraft. At the very bottom of this section, you get a little figure of your aircraft, but this picture isn't important at all. Instead, look at the missiles around it. Whenever you fire a missile, you see the missile icon gray out and then slowly glow again. This is the recharge time for your missiles, so you can only fire when it's 100% recharged. Yes, your missiles recharge in the air in Ace Combat. I don't know what kind of sorcery the planes have, but the new missiles, they just show up under your wings. The same thing happens with your flares, but it takes some more time to recharge. Now that you know where to find the information about your weapons, let's talk about aircraft weapon and their selection. In the Ace Combat series, each aircraft comes with several specifications and stats, so it's easy to compare plane A with plane B and so on. Most games have 6 different stats: speed, mobility, stability, defense, air-to-air, and air-to-ground. Tomcat 171 has already covered the first 3, so now let's take a look at defense, air-to-air, and air-to-ground. Defense simply refers to how much damage your aircraft can take without exploding into a million pieces. The more defense you have, the more pain you can endure. To demonstrate this, let's make a comparison between the F-16, the most fragile aircraft in the game, against the A-10, the plane with the best armor. In the normal difficulty, the F-16 can take 2 missiles. Take 3 and you're dead. Meanwhile, the A-10 is able to get hit by 1, 2 and even 3 missiles without any problem. Surely you might get some fire on your engine or wing, but that is only a visual indicator of damage. As a matter of fact, the amount of damage you have in Ace Combat does not affect the fight physics of your aircraft. One important thing to remember is that difficulty is the key factor when it comes to aircraft damage. The higher difficulty you play, the more damage you get. So while you've needed to be hit 4 times by enemy missiles in normal in order to get shot down with the A-10, in the Ace difficulty you only need 1 single enemy missile, and that is for pretty much all playable aircraft. Of course, missiles aren't the only enemies that can hit you. Flak and AA fire are also other things to worry about. The same idea applies for these other types of damage. Here's a quick comparison between the normal and Ace difficulties again. As you can see, by the time you start playing on higher difficulties, the defense of your aircraft will virtually become irrelevant because almost everything will be able to destroy you or at least give you a lot of damage. As for the air-to-air and air-to-ground stats, they indicate how well your aircraft can perform different types of missions. An aircraft with good air-to-air capabilities is very fast, very agile, and has a quick response to your control inputs. Take for example the Sukhoi 47. Its high acceleration and high top speed mean you can get across the battle area very quickly. Its maneuverability is also very high, so you can get behind enemy aircraft during a dogfight easily, which is also due to its short response time for control inputs. On the other hand, aircraft with good air-to-ground stats tend to be slow, not very maneuverable, but at the same time they are very stable and have a low stall speed. In other words, you can fly slower without falling from the sky. One good example is the A-10. Honestly, the A-10 is very slow, but it doesn't really need that much speed because it was meant to attack ground targets which are very slow, or sometimes they don't move at all. Since the A-10 flies very slow, this translates into more time for the pilot to be able to identify, select, and destroy enemy ground targets. The A-10 is a stable platform as well. Move your control inputs and only small changes will be made to your flight path. This comes in very handy when you're going for that strafing pass. Furthermore, the higher air-to-air and air-to-ground stats your plane has, the faster it will be for your aircraft to get a lock onto the respective enemy. So let's make a quick comparison. Here are two aircraft, one with high and another one with low air-to-air stats. Notice how much time it takes from switching and locking on from one target to the other. And here's the opposite situation on ground targets. Surely the delay isn't massive, but it's something noticeable and you should keep that in mind. In order to pick a good aircraft, be sure to pay attention to the briefing of each mission as it outlines the composition of the enemy forces, then select an aircraft accordingly. In Ace Combat there are three categories of aircraft: fighters, attackers, and multi-role aircraft. Fighters are meant for shooting down other aircraft and they have a high air-to-air stats. Attackers are designed to destroy ground targets and they have a high air-to-ground stats. Meanwhile, multi-role planes are meant to engage both air and ground enemies, which usually translate into a loss of effectiveness since the aircraft was designed to do more than just one task. For new players, I highly recommend you to start with a multi-role aircraft if you're given the option, just because their stats are more balanced. But wait, there still is another important factor to consider: the selection of your weaponry. Each aircraft in Ace Combat comes equipped with a gun and standard missiles, but you're able to choose one special weapon. Each aircraft has different weapons to choose from, and usually you have 3 choices. These special weapons are usually more powerful than your standard missiles at the expense of a lower ammunition count. Again, be sure to pay attention to the briefing in order to equip your plane with a useful weapon for that particular mission. I will describe the types of weapons available in a few minutes. Now, one question some new players may have is:
so, if I pick a stealth aircraft like the F-22 or the Nighthawk, does that mean the enemy won't be able to detect me?
Unfortunately, this is not the case. Although I mentioned earlier that stealth enemy aircraft are harder to detect, this does not apply to the player, otherwise it would break the experience. As a matter of fact, there is one very small disadvantage when playing with a stealth aircraft. Since the weapons are stored in internal base, usually there is some delay in the firing and activation of the tracking system of your missiles. Take the F-22 for example. If you want to activate the gun, it won't open fire instantaneously unlike other aircraft. Instead, there is a very short but noticeable delay in the opening of the gun port, and this delay can be the difference between shooting down or missing an enemy target. So never ever choose an aircraft just because it is stealth, as there is no benefit to you. Although, let's be honest, they definitely look cool, and at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Now that you know how to evaluate your aircraft when it's time to choose one, let's talk about the different types of weapons you have available, starting with the most classic of them all. The gun, or more specifically your cannon, is included in every single playable aircraft and is by far the hardest weapon to use because it simply takes more skill in aiming and firing at the correct time. However, the gun is arguably the coolest and most rewarding weapon to use. Like when you get that trick shot at an enemy at a high angle, or simply use your A-10 to unleash hell on the ground with its... The gun is the perfect weapon for low value and low mobility targets such as containers and fuel tanks, but it can be very useful when several targets are lined up in one direction like a column of tanks or trucks. That is your perfect opportunity for a strafing run. For air targets, guns are easy to use on large and slow enemy aircraft such as bombers and transport planes. Of course, the main drawback of the gun is its short range. Once you get in range, you will see a round reticule indicating where it is aiming. Distance is measured by the inner circle, as you can see in this case. Whenever using the gun, bear in mind two considerations. First is that the reticule depends on the selected target, and secondly, the angle where the gun points at is different for each plane. Here's a comparison between the Tornado and the Sukhoi 47. While both planes are flying level, you can see that the angle of the gun in the Tornado is directed downwards, while in the Sukhoi it is slightly upwards. Of course, this reflects the role of each aircraft. Since the Tornado is an attacker, you can see how handy the angle comes in for ground attacks and low level flying, because you don't have to point your nose to the ground to attack enemy targets. If you use a Sukhoi 47 instead, you would have less time to attack ground targets because eventually you would have to pull up. As far as your gun ammunition goes, if you play on the easier difficulties, you get unlimited gun ammo, and in the higher difficulties, you get around 800 rounds for each aircraft. In Ace Combat, there is no limit to your fire rate, so you can hold the gun trigger until your ammunition is depleted. So enjoy your... The standard missile is the weapon you will be using the most as you play Ace Combat, but unlike real life, you can use your standard missile against air, ground, and naval targets. Every playable aircraft is equipped with two missiles. You can fire them separately or in quick succession. However, you can only fire against one enemy aircraft, unlike some other special weapons capable of locking to multiple targets at the same time. The standard missiles inflict regular damage, and usually one of them is enough to destroy light ground targets such as SAMs or AA guns. Generally, two missiles are necessary in order to shoot down enemy aircraft, but keep in mind, larger aircraft or naval vessels may require more than two missiles in order to be destroyed. As for the range of the standard missiles, the numbers vary from game to game, but they are considered a short-range weapon. The tracking of the standard missiles also vary from game to game. For instance, in Ace Combat 6, your missiles are somewhat less maneuverable than in previous games. Therefore, getting a good launch position is essential. A future video in this series will cover air-to-air combat tactics and will include some firing positions. But ideally, you want to be exactly behind the enemy target. Sometimes attacking the enemy aircraft from head-on also works. However, attacking enemy planes flying perpendicular to you usually results in a waste of missiles. The same for attacking from above or below. As for ground targets, usually any firing position is good since they are either stationary or very slow. Just don't fire when there are obstructions between your aircraft and the enemy. Now it's time to talk about the different weapons you're able to choose. Basically, there are 5 different categories of weapons: unguided air-to-ground weapons, guided air-to-ground weapons, air-to-air weapons because all of them are guided, point and shoot weapons. I know it sounds like the name of those normie cameras, but I'm referring to lasers and railguns. And lastly, there are defensive weapons or countermeasures. There are way too many weapons in Ace Combat, so for the sake of this video, I will only be covering the most important ones. For air-to-air special weapons, we have the QAAMs, the XMAAs, the XLAAs, and the SAAMs. All of these weapons are guided, but there are some different ways of comparing them, such as range, damage, missile maneuverability, tracking method, and whereas you can lock onto multiple targets at the same time. The quick maneuver air-to-air missiles are medium range, high damage, and fire and forget missiles. What makes this weapon special is its super maneuverability and tracking against enemy air targets. With the QAAMs, you can hit enemies from some very difficult angles. The QAAM can only be fired against one enemy target, so after you fired your missile, simply change target, get a lock, and fire again. The QAAMs are very useful when dealing with high value and high maneuverable enemy targets such as enemy aces. The advanced medium range air-to-air missiles are medium range, high damage, fire and forget missiles. This type of missiles have slightly better tracking than your standard missiles, and what makes them special is the ability to lock onto several enemy targets simultaneously. With your AAM selected, as soon as the enemies enter in range, you will see the lock-on icon appear. The number of targets will depend on the amount of missiles you carry, because some aircraft carry 4 missiles, while other aircraft carry 6 missiles. The advanced long-range air-to-air missiles work on the same manner, but as the name states, they have longer range. These two weapons are useful for destroying large amounts of enemies from long range, but bear in mind that since you're firing from longer range, enemies have more time to react and evade your missiles. Therefore, these weapons are more effective against large and slow targets such as bombers or transports. Lastly, we have the semi-active air-to-air missile. This is a very powerful long-range missile, but there is a catch. After you fire the missile on the desired target, you have to keep the target inside the circle at the center of your screen in order for the missile to track to its target. If, for some reason, the target is able to move outside of the circle, quickly correct your aim in order to ensure a missile hit. It is also possible to fire at 2 enemy targets at the same time, but then you have to keep both of them inside the circle. SAAMs are very useful in destroying highly maneuverable targets such as fighters from long range. However, this weapon is ill-suited for close-range engagements because at each enemy maneuver, the closer you are, the more you have to correct your aim. Just like missiles, there's a wide variety of guided air-to-ground weapons, including the LASM, the XAGM, the SOD, and the GPB. We can compare air-to-ground weapons based on their lock-on range, damage inflicted, damage radius, and the ability to lock onto different targets simultaneously. The long-range air-to-surface missile is self-explanatory. Pick an enemy target from long range, fire a missile, and watch it explode. The blast radius of the LASM is small, but inflicts heavy damage, so this weapon is perfect to destroy high-value targets. Moreover, because of the long range, you're generally able to attack enemy targets while remaining outside of the enemy's attack range. This is very useful when dealing with enemy ships because you can just sink those battleships from distance. The LASM can only lock onto one target, so after you fire, pick another one and unleash destruction. The advanced air-to-ground missiles, on the other hand, are able to lock onto multiple enemy targets. They share the same characteristics of the LASM, small blast radius but high damage. However, they are not long-range missiles. The XAGMs are useful in destroying a group of high-value targets that are spread over some distance. The standoff dispenser is a missile that flies over the target while releasing several detonation charges. This is a medium-range, moderate damage weapon that has a peculiar blast radius. It destroys enemies inside a rectangular area. Though you can lock onto only one enemy target, this weapon can hit several enemies if they are forming a column. In order to take advantage of this weapon, be sure to have your aircraft aligned with the enemy column to ensure maximum destruction. The guided penetration bomb is yet another weapon you can use. It has a lot of damage, but you can only lock at one target at a time. Its blast radius is very small and the range is just a little bit over your regular missiles. GPBs don't really have an advantage over the weapons mentioned previously, but if you are feeling confident, you can also use it as a free fall bomb from long range, though this usually ends up as a waste of ammo. Unguided weapons such as the UGB, the FAEB, the BDSP, and the SFFS are simple to explain. You just need to aim them with the reticule that appears in the center of your HUD. Mind you, you can only change the aim by either moving your aircraft around or by accelerating or decelerating. The only main difference between them is the type of damage they inflict and their blast radius. Unguided bombs can come in different sizes, small or large, and they will destroy enemies around a circular area. UGBs are better used to destroy groups of enemies inside a certain perimeter. The fuel-air explosive bomb works in a slightly different manner. Instead of just detonating it, it fills the airspace over the target with fuel, which is then ignited. The FAEB covers a wider area but inflicts less damage. It comes in handy to destroy several low-value targets such as containers, tents, or trucks, but it isn't very effective against enemy tanks. The Bomblet's Disperser bomb is basically having a container under your aircraft that drops several smaller bombs all at once. It is almost the same concept of the standoff disperser. In your HUD, you see two icons connected by a dashed line. Assuming that you keep your current flight path and speed, the bombs will hit the space between the two icons. Just like the standoff disperser, the BDSP is better suited for attacking enemy columns of ground targets. However, a steady flight path is necessary in order to ensure accuracy. The self-forging fragmentation submunitions bomb is basically like throwing a bomb that explodes in mid-air only to make mini bombs rain from the sky to the enemy targets. Although the concept is similar to the BDSP mentioned earlier, here you don't have any control of the fragmentation because you don't really get to aim the impact of the smaller bombs, which is very bad news if you have some allied forces nearby. But if you don't have allies close to the action, then you can use this weapon to inflict damage on a circular area. And finally, I should also make a quick mention of the unguided rockets. Once you press the button to fire them, your plane will fire a salvo of rockets. Each rocket will have its own trajectory, but there is a considerable amount of spread, so you want to use the rockets as close as possible to the target. If you want to concentrate the rockets onto a heavier target, keep your flight course steady, and if you want to increase the area in order to hit more targets, then move your flight path around to change the direction of the rockets. Of course, rockets were meant to destroy a heavily defended ground target or a group of smaller ground targets, but you can also use rockets on enemy ships and even aircraft. It is much harder to do so, but way more fun. Point and shoot weapons are just like what the name says. You point the aim at the enemy and fire. If your aim is right, the enemy has basically no chance to evade your attacks. For this demonstration, here are the railguns from Ace Combat 6. Although usually other Ace Combat games have some sort of laser weaponry you can use. Ultimately, this concept is the same. Once the reticule is over the enemy, you just need to fire and they will be hit instantaneously. Older Ace Combat games had a one-shot, one-kill mechanic, but thanks to the multiplayer system in their newer titles, the point-and-shoot weapons were nerfed. Ideally, you want to destroy enemies from as far away as possible since there is no range limitation. The only limitation is, in fact, your ability to aim at the targets. For this type of weaponry, you want to avoid close-range combats because any small maneuver by the enemy will result in a large angle of correction to the player. Of course, I'm referring to enemy aircraft, but this type of weaponry can also be used against ground or naval units. So far, we've covered many ways to inflict damage to your enemies, but there are also two ways to protect yourself. The first one is by equipping your aircraft with an ECM pod. When activated, the electronic countermeasures pod will jam any incoming enemy missiles, making them miss you. Because you can only activate your ECM pod a few times, it is better to save it for when you get into a very dangerous airspace, one filled with enemy SIMs or enemy fighters. Also, when you're after a high value target and you don't want to be disturbed by the enemies chasing you, you can activate your ECM pod in order to buy you some time. Another way of defending yourself is by using flares. Flares confuse the heat-seeking sensor of the enemy missiles, so instead of coming after you, the missiles go after the flares. Note that the flares are only useful when the missiles are coming in from behind your aircraft, because the flares need to be between your plane and the missile. Like the ECM pods, flares are better used in order to buy you some time so you can focus on chasing a high value target. However, before you throw some flares, look at your radar and make sure that the missiles are coming from behind you, otherwise this will be a waste of ammo. Also, keep in mind that flares take some time to recharge, and not all Ace Combat games have flares like Ace Combat 6. I was going to end the video now, but as some of you pointed out, we forgot to include the in-flight refuelings minigame in the first episode. I know in-flight refuelings may look difficult to new players, but they are not. You just need to be very precise with the controls. So the way to complete the in-flight refuelings is to stay very close to the tanker aircraft for a short period of time. Look at the indicator at the center. Your goal is to match the two squares. You can use the two lines to correct for your altitude and for your course. If you're still getting used to the controls of Ace Combat, try not to roll your aircraft. Instead, keep it flying level. When you need to correct your course, only use pitch and yaw. Correct one at a time. So if you are too low and to the right, first climb to the altitude of the tanker. That is, when the horizontal line stays on the center. Now that you got that corrected, let's correct the direction so you can get behind the tanker. Apply some yaw to the desired side. Press on the button slightly and then let it go. You will gradually move behind the tanker. Once you are exactly behind it, apply yaw to the direction of the tanker in order to align yourself with the tanker. Now that your position is correct, you only need to master the speed. If you are behind the tanker, press your acceleration for just a little bit and then let it go. This part is all about very light corrections. When you see the hold position message, make sure your power is set at idle and keep your plane there. It may take a couple of times to get this right, but it is all a matter of practice. And if you want to really challenge yourself, try to hold the position upside down. It's hard, but it's possible. This concludes the episode on the use of weaponry in the Ace Combat games. Tomcat 171 will be uploading the next episode, which will feature tactics for air-to-air engagement, so be sure to subscribe to his channel as well. A link is provided in the description. While you're at it, be sure to take a look at Project Lighthouse website for some very informative articles about Ace Combat and the upcoming title Ace Combat 7. I would like to thank you for watching Ace Combat 101, and I hope that information presented here has been useful. If you have any questions, please let us know in the comments so we can answer them in the upcoming videos. Once more, thank you for watching and see you guys next time.